This is Joe with US Sander, and I'm going to show you how to rebuild a UFO orbital attachment. This one I have here is locked up. So the first thing we want to do is flip it over, take this bottom plate off. Now that that's off, we need to take these 4 screws off so we can take this bottom plate. With those screws out, this should come off without too much difficulty. In some cases, you might need to take a soft base hammer and tap on this flange until it works its way off. Okay, with that off, we can check to see if it turns over yet. Still locked up, so that tells me it's something further down. These 4 screws hold this whole assembly in, so we're going to take that off next. We're going to remove these 4 screws and take this whole bottom plate off. Okay, we have 1 screw here that is stripped out. If you get a screw that's too tight and strips out, what you're going to need to do is get a left-hand drill bit that's 1/4 inch diameter. You can usually get that at a good hardware store. And run your drill in reverse. Drill the center of that head out. When it goes through the end, it'll catch that and thread the screw right out. Now with that out, this whole center tree will come right out. This one right here is locked up. That's our culprit. While we've got this apart, we want to check the main bearing. This one turns a little bit stiff, so we want to clean that out. These 6 screws hold this main gear on, and that's what retains the bearing. Looks like we've got a screw here that's stripped out. What I find works best for that is if you've got one of these star bits, find the one that's closest to fitting. Tap that in with a hammer, and you can usually get it to loosen the screw. Make sure you replace that screw when you put it back together. Now that we've got the screws out, we can flip this the other way. Take a soft base hammer. And knock that right out. Now that we have this out, we need to pop the seals off of either side of this bearing. Use a small pick and very carefully pull up on that seal. Do the same on the other side. You want to be careful you don't damage the lip on the seal. This one's not in too bad condition. Oftentimes we'll see this will be filled right up with caked in dust. The dust mixes with the grease and becomes like a paste. And that'll lock this thing right up. Now I typically clean this out with parts cleaner. Never use any solvents on these seals. It'll expand the rubber and you won't be able to get the seal to seat back in the bearing properly. Just wipe them with a dry rag. Inside here, there's a little lip. That's what actually seals against the bearing. You want to make sure that you get the dust out of that little lip. Just have to clean up this bearing and we'll be ready to put it back together. Now that we've got the bearing all cleaned and dried, it's time to put it back together. You want to put your bottom seal in first. because we'll grease it from the top. That way, as it runs, the grease can run down through the bearing. I prefer to use the blue edger grease, but pretty much any grease will work as long as it's not too thick of a grease. A thicker grease won't flow through the bearing very well. You just want to run a little bead across the top of that bearing. Don't put too much in, because we still have to put the seal in. With that done, you can spin it a little to work that grease in. Then put our top seal in. Make sure this outside ring actually clips in properly. And your bearing's done. To reinstall your bearing, set your main housing up on some blocks to make sure you've got clearance for this clutch. Set your bearing in there. We just want to tap it in gently. Here when it bottoms out. Now our main ring gear. You want to check your teeth on the big gear. If you see a lot of dips in the teeth where the other gears mesh with them, then that gear most likely needs to be replaced. In this case, those teeth look to be in really good condition, so we're going to leave this gear. Line up your screws. We want to put a little dot of blue Loctite on each of these screws to make sure they don't loosen back up. Run these screws in by hand because you don't want to strip them out. I'm going to gently tap on this to make sure the gear's seated. Snug up all those screws. Now we're ready to change the bearings in this tree. There's little clips, spiral clips around each one of these gears. We need to take all of these off so we can press the bearings out. Typically what works best is using a small screwdriver and a pick so you can pull out on the clip and pry it up. Sometimes if there's too much tension on that clip, it won't move, so you'll have to take and tap the gear back that way to loosen up that clip. Once it's started, just turn that gear, keep your screwdriver in between the clip and the gear, that pops it right off. This one's going to be a little trickier because it's the one that's locked up. So since I can't turn that, I have to chase the clip around with my pick. Now that we have all four of those clips off, it's time to press the bearings out. My preferred method is to support this here and here and hope that this shaft presses out of the bearing. If it doesn't, then we'll have to remove this entire counterweight and support the bearing to press the shaft out. Before we put the new bearings in, we're going to have to pull these screws out. If you were successful at pressing your shafts out of the bearings, you'll still have bearings in here, which will make things a little easier for you. Pull these 4 screws, and then press out any bearings that you might have left in there. Then we can reinstall the new ones. Now we can press the new bearings in this tree. Then we want to make sure that they are seated all the way. Press only on the outside race. Before we reinstall the gears, we want to put these 4 screws back in. I like to use new screws. A little dab of blue Loctite. Because these bearings came out with the shafts, we're going to have to remove the counterweight from the eccentric in order to press the bearing off the shaft. I recommend doing them one at a time. That way you don't get them mixed up. That allows you to put a nice mark to line it back up when you're done. The other option is to put the mark offset quite a bit so you can easily identify which one was which. Now we remove the 2 screws that hold this on. Make sure these stay together in pairs. They'll typically be marked so you can identify it if you do get them mixed up. Now we can press these shafts out of the bearings. Now that we have the bearings removed, it's time to put these counterweights back on the gears. If you're replacing any of these gears, then you're going to have to realign it the hard way. The way they typically work is the heaviest, thickest part here goes towards the center of this weight. Typically you're just sort of eyeballing it, and then we can fine-tune it once we get the tree installed. Put a dab of blue Loctite on each of these screws to make sure they don't loosen up. We want to realign our mark that we made earlier. Snug these screws down. Try to keep the cap even. We're ready to press those gears back in. Now we're going to have to put these clips back on, replace any that might be damaged. Pull out on this lower edge. You want to use a screwdriver to set that over into the groove. And then push on this top edge of the clip until it snaps. That's half on. Now we can chase it around, pushing down on that edge with a screwdriver until it's in. If you've got an old UFO, you might have one of these old cast aluminum trees instead of the new style one. There was 2 different versions of these. There was one like this, and then there was one that was beefed up, so it had a continuous circle here, but the way you can identify them is they've got this small pocket the size of the gear, as opposed to the new style, which has the entire top open. If you've got one of these, you want to inspect it closely for cracks, because they typically cracked in here, which was why we increased the diameter of this, because that was the weakest point right between the screws. Typically these had the old style gears, which were held in with a nut. Pretty often on these we would see the end of the shaft broken off. That's why the new gears are made as one piece. If you have any broken, you're going to want to replace them with either with these old style or replace this whole assembly. I have seen the new gears installed in one of these, but it's tricky because there's very little clearance here. You typically have to shim the bearings in order to make them fit. You can't mix and match the gears because these ones are slightly off from the other ones, so make sure that all 4 gears are the same style. To replace bearings on these is a little bit different of a process because of the many pieces involved. You can't install the shaft first very easily, so I recommend always taking off these counterweights when you go to replace these. First thing we want to do is mark our counterweights so that we can make sure to put them back together the same way they came apart. It's typically a little tricky to keep them all together, but you want to do the best you can at that. Makes it a whole lot easier to adjust them later on. With the counterweights removed, these bearings can now be pressed out. There are screws here, but it's often easier to just press the bearings out, and it'll distort that screw a little bit and often loosen it up so that it can be removed easier. If you do run into trouble removing the screws on these, they'll most likely need to be drilled. Some of the others have a through hole, so you can drill it from the back side. Makes it easier to remove without damaging the threads. You want to press this entire assembly out. With these off, now we can disassemble them. We don't want to do like we do with the other ones, pressing the bearing into the housing first. In this case, we want to put it back together as an assembly like this and then press the whole unit in, which is why we had to remove the counterweights, because you can't press on this or it will go crooked. You must press on the outside race. Once the nut's removed, this gear will come off. There is a small key in the shaft. This spring washer has the middle is bowed up towards the gear, and then the bearing comes off. You always want to inspect these carefully. This keyway has a tendency to wear. If that's worn, then the gear won't take its share of the load, which will cause additional strain on the others and could cause them to break. With the new bearing, you can press that on. Put your washer on, make sure it is centered because there is that slight step in this shaft. You want to line that up properly. Be careful as you press this back on that the key remains in the shaft. If it wants to push out, you might need to use a little screwdriver to hold it in place as you press this on gently. Center that washer and reinstall the nut. Once that's tightened down, we can reinstall these back in the housing. Be careful when pressing these in that it doesn't go crooked, which is why we never press on this as it's offset. Always use a proper tool to press on that outer race. Once that's installed, we can put the counterweights back on and reinstall it in the UFO just like we would with the new style. It's important that we get these gears all lined up exactly the same. Otherwise, we won't be able to put the bottom plate back on. If you've got a straight edge handy, you can use these eccentrics, counterweights, as a guide to line them up. If you put new gears on, these won't necessarily be lined up correctly, so you might have to tweak it a little bit. Usually you can get the first gear just started, and the second one. Keep some sideways force on it. It's rather difficult sometimes to keep them all lined up. Now we check it with the bottom plate. It looks like they are all in the correct position. If one's out of place, you'll see it won't line up with the bearing, and you'll have to pull it back up and readjust that. Now we've line up our 4 holes. We're going to put those screws in. Never use Loctite on those because they are difficult to get out as it is. If you put Loctite on it, you'll never get them back out. We recommend changing all the bearings at once, so we're going to change these 4 as well. You got 4 screws here that hold the bearings in. You're going to need to take those out. Now we can press the bearings out. We recommend using only Nachi brand bearings because other bearings, the seal surface is not very high quality and they'll tend to load up with dust very quickly. You want to make sure that you press the bearing by the outer race, not the inner race, because that can damage the bearing. Now we just need to install the screws back in these 4 holes and we're good to go. I usually prefer to use new screws instead of the old ones because they often strip out the head when you're removing them because of the Loctite. You want to put a dab of blue Loctite on each one to make sure it doesn't loosen up. Next, we want to put this bottom plate on. Make sure this lines up perfectly. If you've got a bearing that's a little out of place, in this case, this one here is just slightly on the outside. It's giving me some difficulty putting this on. So that means this bearing is not properly seated. What I do is take a punch on the side direction it needs to move. Give it a little extra to seat that properly until the bearing lines up the way it should. Now that this plate is on, we just want to check if it rocks, which it does in this case. So we want to turn it 1/4 of a turn. Because most likely our bottom plate is a little bit off, and now it doesn't rock anymore. So we won't be putting any tension on it when we tighten those screws. Again, we use a little bit of blue Loctite when we put these bottom plate screws in. Now this this UFO turns over hard. You can feel something binding. So we'll take that plate back off and look and see what's happening. Most likely one of our counterweights was hitting this bottom plate somewhere because it turns over fine with the bottom plate removed. Could be one of these screw heads is sticking up just a little too much, so we'll have to trim those as well. Now we'll put this back on and see what happens. That feels much better. Let's see if it stays that way when we put our screws in. Now that turns over fine without any binding. If you have a problem where you can't get it to stop binding, the best solution is to put some shims in between these bearings and the gears. We don't want to put the drive plate on just yet because we still need to adjust the clutch, and in order to do that we need to anchor this to the bench. So what I use is this little bar here that I can clamp in the vise. That way I'll be able to hold this put while I adjust that clutch. With this anchored in the vise by that plate we put on the bottom, it's time to take this clutch apart. This nut here is locked against the spanner nut, so you're going to need one of these spanner wrenches to hold that in place, and a 15/16 socket to loosen this up. With that nut off, the spanner nut will now come off. And this entire top clutch will remove. Sometimes they come a little hard. Now that we have that out, we can see that there is degreaser on the surface here from when we cleaned out that bearing. That's why it's always important to clean this up whenever you service a UFO. I often see grease or oil that might have leaked from the gearbox onto this surface. That will affect its performance and make this slip prematurely. Inside of this clutch we have a bronze washer, followed by a spring, then we have a steel shim washer and another larger bronze washer. We need to clean up all these parts. This has some rust on it. We're going to need to remove that rust because that will affect this clutch's performance. This rust causes an uneven surface, which will cause this clutch to grip inconsistently. So what we want to do is clean that rust off with a cleaning disc or very fine sandpaper, like 150 grit. Now with that all cleaned up, we need to clean this clutch surface. This friction material is the same basic material as is used on brakes on a car. So what we use is a brake parts cleaner. Spray alone won't clean it, so use some good paper towels. And wipe that surface. If this surface looks glazed, you're going to want to use the same abrasive wheel we used to clean up the clutch plate. With the clutch all cleaned up, now we can start reassembling it. Make sure you clean this with some brake cleaner after using the abrasive wheel, just to remove any fine surface dust that may be stuck to it. Now we put this clutch top in first. Followed by our bronze washer, our flat steel washer, our concave spring washer. Make sure the center points up. Some of the old ones had a thinner washer, which would tend to fail over time. We now use a thicker washer. You can see the difference between those two washers by measuring the thickness. The old washer measures about 40 to 50 thousandths thick, and the newer, thicker washers measure closer to 80 thousandths. So they're quite a bit thicker. If you've got the old thin washer, you're going to want to replace it with the big washer. On top of that washer is this bronze. Your spanner nut has a slight raised portion here that goes down towards that bronze washer. Followed by the jam nut. The intended purpose behind this clutch is for it to slip about a quarter of a turn at startup to lessen the wear on your buffer and give it that little bit more power it needs on startup. Here in the shop we have a tool we can attach to it to measure the torque it takes to make that slip. What we're looking for is about 70 to 90 foot-pounds. In this case, it's way too tight. I can't make it slip at all. So I'm going to have to back that off a little bit. We back that off a quarter of a turn. Let's see if we can make it work now. Okay, slips at about 90 foot-pounds of torque, which is right where we want it. Now we can take this back off. And most of these have washers, unless your UFO is very old. You want to make sure that this rubber washer lines up with the bearing. That keeps some of the dust out of that bearing. If we look at this side, we see that this one is slightly offset. That's the hole we want to be using. So if we find one that closely matches, we can simply line it up with that. Now with our UFO all back together, let's just verify that it's working the way we want it. The simplest test for that is place it face down on the bench and turn it over. If this works the action of the UFO, that means it's moving freely enough. If that whole bottom plate wants to turn on the bench, then your UFO is too stiff. You're going to have to take it apart and find out why.